usually say, hey, DJ, are you obsessed by Ibrahim Traoré? My answer is simple. I am obsessed with transformative leadership, which is why I am then obsessed by extension with Thomas Sankara, now Ibrahim Traoré, Patrice Lumumba. And the common denominator that those three have is that they all became leaders in their mid-20s. Ibrahim Traoré, he was born in a village called Kera, is a very agricultural part of the country. So for him, agriculture is something that is also within him, because like millions of Africans, he grew up in an agricultural village. Having talked to the Bwakali themselves, having even met some of them, one definite thing that he has really tried to do is focusing a lot on value addition, because he too believes a lot in decolonizing Africa and realizes that unless we add value to our produce so that we sell it, we remain beholden to the foreigners. From things like value addition to tomatoes, there are people who say that, but that's a simple thing. Then ask yourself why you go to the supermarket here in Nairobi. A lot of the ketchup you find is imported. The African Union, just like the United Nations, needs a complete overhaul. In its current formation, the African Union cannot be truly responsive to the present-day needs of Africa. The African Union must become more of an organized movement and not a bureaucratic body. The Organization of African Unity, which was there in the early 1960s when African countries started gaining independence, was actually arguably a bit more effective. The African Union is no longer responsive to the contemporary needs of Africa. Whether it is the war, whether it is a famine, you would be hard-pressed to find something that the African Union has successfully worked on. Ask yourself, why is it that the colonialists came to Kenya? They found Kenyans consuming millet, sorghum. There was zero processed food in the country, but people were not dying of hunger. In fact, people were so healthy. In fact, the life expectancy of Kenya 100 years ago and Tanzania and most of Africa was a lot higher. Currently, the life expectancy of a country like Nigeria is 56 years old. The life expectancy of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, it is 86 years old. So how is it that you have a whole 30 years difference? It means that in a country like Kenya, when our life expectancy was higher before the colonialists, one of the reasons was the food. It was a millet, it was a sorghum, it was that best starch that our people were consuming. We will observe a lot of trucks, big or small, bringing food into Kenya from Tanzania. Now, when a lot of those trucks go back to Tanzania, they are empty. They are not carrying any food. What Kenyans do not know, and they should know today, is that a lot of the food they consume, those onions that you slice in your kitchen to make kachumbari or to make, whatever gravy you're having, a lot of them are from Tanzania. Now, you've got to then ask yourself the question, does Kenya really need to be importing onions?
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Organic Guy podcast. This is your home of organic conversations. I'm your host, the Organic Guy, and around here we have conversation on how we can make our food system work for us rather than against us. Today, I do have a special guest with us. You probably seen him. You probably had his content. He has a deep knowledge on our African continent. So I hope by the end of this conversation, you'll have a little bit of more ideas and better ideas on how we can decolonize the African continent and most importantly our food system. So this is going to be fun. He goes by the name of DJ Bwakali. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
You have a very interesting background, but the most thing that stands out for me is how you introduce yourself. So you always say that Africa is your superpower. So what do you mean by that?
You see, when we talk about Africa being our superpower, or when I talk about Africa being my superpower, it's not just a tagline to get the show started. It is a tagline, yes, but every single word there is true, because when the African people go back to the essence of who they are, then they begin to recapture that latent power that lies within them. Now, to put it in a more concrete fashion, here you're the organic guy. And by the way, you're doing a great job, because this is a conversation that really has to be up and about the African continent. Now, when you talk about organic farming, for instance, it's something that as recent as our great-grandparents were doing exclusively that. And then in the name of civilization, the African walked away from that. So from an agricultural context, Africa being my superpower would simply mean that I'm going back to my essence, and that essence is organic farming. It is not rocket science, neither is it an imported technology. We've always had it. So whatever topic that you pick, any topic that you pick, any sector of society that you look at, if we as Africans go back to the essence of that, then that latent superpower within us begins to come out.
Yeah, I think that also makes sense. And before we get into the conversation, I'd like first to get into your early childhood because I'm a huge believer that how you grow up and where you grew up somehow has like an impact on who you become later in life. So help take us through your like early childhood. Like, who are you as a person? Were you more of an extrovert, introvert? What was going on in that space?
Yeah, you're totally right that what we are as a child really sets the stage of what we become later on. It doesn't mean that if you had a bad childhood that the rest of your life is doomed to be a bad life, but you essentially are able to still build something very strong if you confront that childhood. So in this context, like many Africans growing up in a low middle class neighborhood in Eastlands, Nairobi, I like to say that we were vegans by circumstance, not by choice. Because, if it's milk, it's expensive. Beef, chicken, those things are expensive in a low income neighborhood. So, but my father always used to tell us, and still does, that what you consume will largely determine your health, not just physically but mentally. So he would tell us that even though you're eating vegetables every single day, it's actually really good for you, So I look at him now, looking way younger than his years, and I realize that it's because of the investment he himself put in what he was consuming. Same thing to my mother. So that plays a very big part in me then realizing that it doesn't mean that when you climb the economic ladder, you begin to take on board all manner of habits because now your purchasing power is a little bit higher or a lot higher. So what really stands out from that childhood has to do with the lifelong habits it gave me in terms of what I consume, in terms of nutrition, and to date, whereas now, of course, like many Africans, I love meat completely, but I'm not addicted to it. Neither do I feel like I have to take it. And even when I do, it is always with the full knowledge that we are not doing this to showcase the fact that now we can afford this or now we are in a certain class. Then the other thing that I can draw from my childhood just has to do with that free-flowing interaction with nature. Now, if you go to a lot of rural Africa, you find that people relate with nature in a very harmonious and symbiotic manner. You don't take time out of your life to go to the river. You go to the river because it's part of you, at least in most of rural Africa. So it was the same with me. And that interaction with our land, such that this land is an extension of who you are because you're planting stuff, you're weeding stuff, you're harvesting stuff, and you're doing it in a collective fashion, in a free-spirited manner. So I think even my eventual work in the environment sector was really informed by that childhood where you regard nature as an extension of you and not as something that you can retreat into once in a while.
Yeah, that's powerful because where you grew up doesn't have to be like capture you like this is now what you have to be, but somehow in some shape or forms informs who you become later through either values or some of the things that you saw when you were growing up. Some of the most interesting question I always have is, it's been 60 years from a Kenyan perspective and from an African perspective since we get independence. Why is it that we are in 2025 now and we can't feed a lot of our people?
That has to be one of the most critical questions that needs to be addressed, not just at the university level, but at the policy level, in the corridors of power. Because to the extent that we don't ask that question frequently and honestly and dig up powerful answers, revolutionary answers, accurate answers, we continue repeating the same mistakes that leave us in this food insecurity, and even at a worse level, that strip away our food sovereignty. And the direct answer to that is because we went away to our initial food systems. You mentioned the word food systems when you started. Let's just retrace our steps a little bit. And I actually urge everybody watching and everybody listening that look for your oldest relative, if you're African. Look for your oldest living relative, and then ask them about their childhood and the food systems that were in place. One of the things that you'll begin to discover is that a lot of these people during their childhood, including my own grandparents, they didn't have to purchase food. That's the starting point, meaning that they were not reliant on external economic forces for their stomachs to be filled, for the food systems to be replenished. So we've got to ask the question, how do we increasingly go back to two things? Number one, as much as possible, not having to purchase most of the food that you consume. Because when we talk about stuff like the ultra-processed food, for example, this morning, if somebody had cereals and another person in the village had sweet potatoes, this one who had cereals, this food on the table had to travel for a very long distance. It had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. It had to cross so many countries to reach your plate. Now, no disrespect to your food, what you're consuming, but I'm just explaining that there's one African in scenario A who simply went to the farm, picked the sweet potato, and consumed it. There's another African in scenario B who had to consume food that was purchased from a supermarket that had to be imported from overseas. Now, this person who had to consume food imported must ask the question, how can I increasingly go back to where my grandfather was? Or even better, lest people accuse us of saying that, we keep saying, let's go back to the past. Even better, this person should ask himself or herself, how can I do what my fellow countryman, my fellow countrywoman today is doing? If you cannot be able to plant that sweet potato, then the second best thing to do is that it's much better to purchase it than to be purchasing this from a health perspective, from an economic perspective. And then, of course, complement that with, if you insist on eating ultra-processed food, then hopefully you can just complement it, but your main diet should comprise of what you can purchase locally or what you can plant locally. Now, having said that, you see, those are household habits. We've got to ask the question, what policy intervention can be put in place to actualize this, to make this easier? And there are so many policy possibilities that the country can begin to look at, not just in Kenya, but across Africa. For example, we have to make it as easy and as profitable as possible for this sweet potato farmer to get their produce to my table in the urban center. If there are any policy interventions that can make that process as easy and, not the second word, as profitable as possible, because if it is profitable, then you get more farmers in this whole ecosystem. And then at that level, we begin addressing food systems. And food sovereignty is right there. Because you see, the three most consumed grains in Africa, of course, would be wheat, rice, and maize. In the case of wheat and rice, they are largely imported. Then in the case of maize, there's nothing wrong with maize, but traditional Africa also had things like sorghum and millet that now we know are actually healthier and can be used to bake stuff. So why aren't we baking millet bread? Why aren't we making millet chapatis? Somebody might say that, what do you mean? C'est pas possible, it's not possible. But I have a newsflash for anybody who feels that way. You see, wheat, until 100 years ago or so, we were not even consuming wheat. It's an acquired culinary habit. So in the same way that we acquired that, we can also acquire a culinary habit of consuming baked millet produce. it's possible, but then there has to be a policy intervention so that maybe we've got to give a lot of tax incentives. We have to give a lot of earning incentives, not just to our farmers, but even to the small businesses, those bakers that are all over Nairobi. If they begin to realize that there's a reward attached to my being able to bake millet bread, then hopefully you get more and more people doing it. And hopefully, inshallah, if we have this podcast again 10 years from now, then maybe we will do so as we devour some millet bread because we love it, not because we're trying to make a statement.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different nuggets that I've gotten from your conversation. So what I'm getting is that there have to be like a system, like all of us, from consumers, from policymakers, from farmers, have to be on the same pot in terms of making sure that we create an environment where the farmers want to grow this food, consumers actually want to buy these foods, and also the policymakers, the government, creates a really good environment and a good policy perspective for them to be able to thrive in that particular environment. I think that's the best way going forward. You mentioned the thing about food sovereignty, and it's something I've seen you talk in the past. So what is the difference then between food sovereignty and then food security?
Yeah, great question. And it's also important for, again, every African to understand the difference, because when you're talking about food security, and I'll explain in a non-technical manner, even share an anecdote or two, so that people can realize we already have this or we already had this. Because if you're looking at food security, it is purely the ability of a nation to feed the people, wherever that food is coming from. So if you're saying that Kenya is food secure, for example, Brian, yet what Kenya is largely consuming is imported wheat. So if somebody in Umoja Estate and Lavington Estate and Kibra, every morning they are consuming mandazi, and a sizable percentage of the wheat used to bake to make this mandazi is from Ukraine and Russia, yes, they are food secure because they are able to eat and their bellies are full. You know, they are not starving, there's no famine. But as we witnessed, the moment there was that war between Ukraine and Russia, I think we all know by now that the wheat supply in Africa was severely affected. And to date, the country and the continent has not fully recovered. You know, there are still gaps because the wheat that we used to import, a large percentage is no longer coming in. So yes, we had food security. Yes, in your household and in my household and millions of others across the continent, you know, the statisticians would say that we are food secure. But in reality, we don't have food sovereignty. Now, this brings me to food sovereignty, which in a nutshell, this guy who is consuming sweet potatoes for breakfast and then consuming African leafy vegetables for lunch from their farm, and then for dinner, consuming rice that was produced locally, whether it is Mwea, maybe this person is in central Kenya region, or Ahero, the western region. Now that's somebody who is embodying food sovereignty because they do not care from a nutrition perspective, from a food perspective. They are not affected by that Russia-Ukraine war, whereas millions of others are affected. So those who are not affected, now that's food sovereignty, if they are not affected. But those who are affected, even though they have 3 meals a day, that may be food security, but it's not food sovereignty. And the thing with food security is it becomes extremely addictive at a macro level, which is why to date, Kenya continues to import huge, massive percentages of rice. Yet when you go to the rice producing places here in Kenya, the farmers are not getting optimal returns from the rice. The farmers are able to produce a lot more rice. I remember, Brian, some 2 months ago, I went to Narok and we met wheat farmers there with their wheat languishing in their stores because there had been mammoth imports of wheat, partly because of corruption, but also partly because we're so addicted to that notion and that fact that we have to import this wheat, you see. So what should then happen is that we have to increasingly move away from food security to food sovereignty because whoever controls what is in your plate and what goes into your stomach controls you. And then until we are able to control our food systems, to control all the food that we consume, we're going to remain beholden to wherever we're importing that food from.
Yeah, and I think this issue needs to be treated as a national security issue because, as you've said, if someone in a foreign country can decide, hey, so from now on, maybe you won't be able to get your wheat supply, right, from, let's say, from Ukraine, or you won't be able to get maize supply from us. So that should be treated as a national security issue because as a nation, we are not really secure from a food perspective. And if you can't feed the people, then they may as well come for you as well. Something interesting that I always think about a lot is that land is a major part of production. And of course, from a colonial point of view, land was one of the major things that moved the fighters, especially for the Mau Mau fighters here in Kenya, that they wanted their land back. And we saw similar things in Zimbabwe. We have similar things happening in South Africa where the natives want their land back. We might not be dealing with such issues at the moment. And I was actually very surprised to see that the early settlers who moved to Kenya, they were actually being given land for a period of 999 years from the British government. Since land is such an important part of production in agriculture, what are you noticing in terms of that there's no that security from an African perspective? You mentioned about if a farmer needs fertilizers, they have to import it, right? So that means their production is actually dependent on an exterior factor. So for that reason alone, they not necessarily don't own that particular land, for they cannot produce without those fertilizers. So what other areas have you seen that from an African perspective and from an agricultural production perspective, we need to decolonize in order to have that food sovereignty?
I'd like to draw this analogy. I want everybody to ask themselves the question, why do they charge their phones? Why do they charge their electronics? And everybody should think back to when your phone was almost dying and you really needed to recharge it because you needed to use it for whatever reasons. Imagine a scenario where you're not recharging that phone, where you're not replenishing it and giving it energy. What's going to happen is that, yes, you'll have the phone, but it's going to be practically useless to you. Then number two, imagine a scenario. In front of me at this moment, I've got a glass of water. So imagine that I'm super thirsty and the water is right there. I'm really, really, really super thirsty, but I am not doing the simple act of picking the glass and drinking this water, either because I'm not strong enough to do so, or I'm oblivious of the fact that there's in fact a glass of water before me. You know, whatever the reason would be, the fact would be that despite having water right in front of me, I can still die of thirst if I don't reach out and consume that water. Now, let me link those two to the question that you've just asked. Starting with the issue of recharging the phone, you see, when the so-called Western civilization landed in Africa via colonialism express, what happened was that the traditional forms of agriculture that used to make room for recharge of the land, for replenishment of the land, were all of a sudden gradually or drastically replaced by agricultural systems that were not working in sync with nature, but were working against nature. What I mean by that is, if you look at something like mung beans, they used to be widely consumed in Kenya. You can still find them a lot, not just in Kenya, but parts of Africa. And I remember asking a farmer in Western Kenya, sometimes last year, that why don't you consume as much mung beans as you used to before? And I remember this farmer saying that the land is no longer conducive for planting mung beans. So yes, they can still continue planting beans and maize, monoculture, which again is not something that is intrinsically African. So mung beans, what any nutritionist can tell you is that mung beans are what are called whole foods because they have a lot of these nutrients in them. You can just pretty much survive on mung beans, but you can't survive on maize alone, for example. Yeah, so the reason why you no longer have mung beans, not just in Kenya again, but in huge swathes of Africa, is simply because we stopped recharging this land. We started treating this phone like somebody who just wants to keep using the phone and forgets that it's got to be recharged. It's got to be replenished. We stopped recharging because all of a sudden now we embrace these agricultural systems that were saying that, number one, you've got to import fertilizer, introduce some new chemical realities into this soil, so that the notion of recharging is now done away with, because these fertilizers are giving us a quick fix. So that fast food mentality that was never really a part of Africa then crept into our entire agricultural system, instead of realizing that, okay, we can plant a multiplicity of crops like we used to anyway, and then we don't have to immediately plant more stuff again. We can give this land some time to replenish. Things like agroforestry that now we read about as if they're alien to Africa, were very much a part of us. And Brian, you're an organic expert, which is why I really celebrate what you're doing, because you're not introducing rocket science to the people. We are just saying, guys, we were doing this and we had food sovereignty. There was barely any famine on this continent. So let us remember that when you talk about land, you also have to talk about recharging this land. You have to talk about working in sync with that land, with nature, and not against it. And then now to the second issue of having this glass of water before me and not being able to consume it, yet I'm super thirsty. I'll give you this statistic that we always quote. And a lot of times we quote it from a point of pride. When we say that Africa has 60% of the world's remaining arable land, we say that very, very proudly, that it's something to be proud of. On the one hand, yes, it is. But on the other hand, why then, to your first question, do we have all this hunger in Africa? Do we have all this famine in Africa? Yet we have 60% of the world's remaining arable land. And it simply goes back to that notion of people then looking at agriculture as something that is separate from who they are. When you go back home, whether you're a banker, whether you're a security official, whether you're the president, when you go back home to your house and you drink water, you don't tell yourself that I'm not a water expert. You just drink water. It's a part of who you are, and you understand that it's part of your flourish. So similarly, we have to begin looking at agriculture from that perspective. We have to look at it from that perspective, which is not to say that everybody should be a farmer, but it is to say that everybody should be agriculturally conscious, endowed with that full knowledge that why is it that we have 60% of the world's remaining arable land, yet hunger remains a present-day reality in Africa, yet food sovereignty remains extremely elusive on this continent. And a direct answer I would give to that, because it's really something we can talk about for long, but a direct answer would be what I call CRE, the corrupt ruling elite that are across Africa usually downplay the possibility of optimizing agricultural output. They downplay this whole issue of land use. How can we use our land in a manner that ensures our food sovereignty? Because that is something that doesn't have quick political rewards. It's a lot easier to focus on a $10 billion highway project because the kickbacks from that are so many, than it is to address agricultural issues that are going to affect hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers, because there are barely any quick kickbacks there, you see. So Africans must make this an electoral issue. This year in 2025, when Tanzania goes to the votes, Mama Suluhu Hassan should in all honesty answer the question, why is it that Tanzania itself is actually one of the main culprits? I remember last year when I was traveling through Tanzania, being absolutely amazed at the sheer size of that country. You know, if you think Kenya is big, just go to Tanzania, and being saddened, really being saddened, Brian, how sometimes you travel through huge swaths of land that have absolutely nothing. Now, if that was because they are recharging, it's okay. But it's not that. It's just that this is idle land that either the government is clueless on what to do with it, or they're not willing to put in the time and the resources it takes to then turn Tanzania into a basket. So the people of Tanzania must make that an electoral issue. In 2027, the people of Kenya must also make it an electoral issue that why is it that you have huge parts of Kenya, semi-arid land, where cassava can actually flourish, where a number of crops, including African rice, you know, there's the Asian rice and African rice. So African rice can actually do well in a fairly semi-arid region. So the people of Kenya should ask all the leading presidential contenders, what are the policy proposals that you want to put in place? And if we elevate the conversation to that level, then these people would have to take directives from the electorate in whom sovereign power is vested.
I'm glad you brought in the issue of Tanzania and Kenya, because it's something I always try to compare. If you look at when we got independence from a Kenyan perspective and a Tanzanian perspective, Kenya, if you were to put it in a blanket, our first president, if you may, Jomo Kenyatta, went into what you could call the capitalistic sort of mindset, right? So it was more of, we are going into the British system where we want to bring a lot more investors in the country, and then they can invest on what we have. And then Mwalimu went into what he called African socialism, the Ujamaa way of sort of bringing people together so that they can work, and then everything they get, they can also eat together. From your perspective, then, what is the do we have to choose in terms of capitalism versus socialism, or is there a system that Africans can actually choose to better sort of give them better results? Because these systems, it seems that they are not working for either of the two parties.
You know, if you go to Namanga, for those who don't know Namanga, that's the border town between Kenya and Tanzania. Usually, if you're going to Arusha from Nairobi, you've got to go through Namanga. Now, if you go to that highway from Namanga all the way to Nairobi, like the first 50, 60 kilometers from the Tanzanian border, you will easily observe a phenomena that vindicates Mwalimu Julius Nyerere's approach, although it's now being messed up by current administration in Tanzania. But it is so strong that my hope is that people would then tell themselves that there must be something here that we can look into. Now, that phenomena is this. You will observe a lot of trucks, big or small, bringing food into Kenya from Tanzania. Anybody should go, and that's exactly what you'll observe. Now, when a lot of those trucks go back to Tanzania, they are empty. They are not carrying any food now to Tanzania. What that tells you, what Kenyans do not know, and they should know today, is that a lot of the food they consume, those onions that you slice in your kitchen to make kachumbari or to make, whatever gravy you're having, a lot of them are from Tanzania. Lots of the food that you consume right here in Kenya is from Tanzania. Now, you've got to then ask yourself the question, does Kenya really need to be importing onions? Because the climatic conditions and the topographical conditions of Tanzania are pretty much like Kenya's. And Kenya, although smaller than Tanzania, is still a massive, huge country, pretty huge country. So why then is it that Kenya is in a place where it has to import a number of these vegetables from Tanzania? Of course, it's great for Tanzania. I'm not saying that we shouldn't trade. In fact, Africa has to trade a lot more with each other. And, I am a lot more happy. There is no comparison with importing onions from Tanzania than wheat from Russia, This one is fine, and that's really food sovereignty also. But the point then I'm making there is that we have to then ask ourselves the question, what was it about this African socialism that seems to be helping Tanzania to produce more optimally than Kenya is, at least agriculturally speaking? And one direct answer to that question is this: the collective approach to agriculture in Tanzania is a win-win scenario for the people of Tanzania, for the farmers in Tanzania, because that collective approach doesn't work as well in Kenya, precisely because capitalism is a Trojan horse. That yes, it came and there's all this talk of free market and everything, but it is not free market if we have to import the rice that we consume. If we even have to sometimes during crazy hunger import maize, corn, so-called corn from the US, that's not food sovereignty. Yes, it is capitalism. Yes, it is free market economy, but at the expense of these smallholders, you see. So we have to systematically dismantle these inherently destructive components of capitalism that have actually worked against the smallholders, which is why today there's a very dangerous trend that is ongoing in Kenya and a number of other countries of huge multinational bodies and foundations making the argument that we have to do away with the smallholder approach. We have to then go to the large-scale modes of farming, because in capitalism, it's all about the profits. The bottom line is the profits. So the same way that we looked at our land and said that recharging this land for a couple of months means less returns, and capitalism doesn't like that, because capitalism wants to say that this year you produced 50 sacks of maize, the following year you produced 60 sacks, the following year you produced 70. Because when that happens, it means that the profits are higher and higher. That's all capitalism cares about. But when you begin to dismantle that, then what we are saying is that how can we help the smallholders to still build a critical mass of agricultural produce? So that, yes, in my farm I may only produce 3 sacks of mung beans, and you may only produce 3 sacks, but maybe 100 of us producing 3 sacks and consuming 1 sack means that we have 200 sacks. Yeah. And now we can get an optimal price for that. Even better, we can add value to this as a cooperative. So this cooperative approach is already strong in Tanzania because it is in the DNA of the country, and they have to build on that a lot, because the warning signal that we can give Tanzania is if they continue fleeing from that foundation in the name of more profits, then they'll simply begin having more and more food security at the expense of food sovereignty, and even that food security will creep towards food insecurity. You see? So we really need to have that conversation, and we must agitate for policies that look at the smallholder farmer in this country, on this continent, as a king and as a queen. Because after all, majority of Africans are fed by smallholders. Yeah, we are not fed by any large farms, but by these smallholders. We just have to help them to have a more cooperative approach when it comes to optimal produce, so that if they're increasingly also earning decent livelihoods from this farming, simply because we took greater control of our food system, then it's a win-win.
Yeah, it's definitely a win-win. And one of the most thought thing about the Ujamaa system, it's the citizens of Tanzania are more coherent. Like, they have less tribalism, if you may, in Tanzania than we do in Kenya. And that is mostly attributed to the fact that Mwalimu was very direct in saying, hey, we are just humans. The topic of just tribalism needs to be on the back foot. So I think that from that perspective also helped them a lot. And you can see Tanzania, if you look from the outside, it's more cohesive and less tribalism than what we have in Kenya. Let's talk about decolonizing our food system. One of the things that a lot of people may not know is that actually maize, I think you mentioned a little bit, is is not indigenous to Kenya. So can you like give us a little bit of history here? Like give us an overview. How did we as Kenya and as African continent become so dependent in maize?
I'd like everybody watching or listening to just pause and write the word sovereignty, literally write it down, and just focus on that word sovereignty for a second. Because the reason I mention sovereignty as an answer to your question is simply because decolonizing in the context of maize, we need to understand that, ask yourself, why is it that the colonialists came to Kenya, found Kenyans consuming? Kenyans were not having any food issues at all. They found Kenyans consuming millet, sorghum, meat. There was zero processed food in the country, but people were not dying of hunger. In fact, people were so healthy. In fact, the life expectancy of Kenya 100 years ago and Tanzania and most of Africa was a lot higher. Currently, the life expectancy of a country like Nigeria is 56 years old. The life expectancy of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, it is 86 years old. So how is it that you have a whole 30 years difference? It means that in a country like Kenya, when our life expectancy was higher before the colonialists, one of the reasons was the food. It was the millet, it was the sorghum, it was that base starch that our people were consuming. Of course, there's also the frequency of the meals, where this whole 3-meal thing is just not African also, because we keep stressing our digestive system, man. I hope somebody one day invents something, some specs. If I look at you, Brian, I can see how there's a lot of food competing to be digested. Because if you're able to do that and I'm able to do that, what will happen is that we will begin to have a different relationship with food. Now back to maize, because I digress a bit. Back to maize. The reason that the British colonialists then introduced maize was because they wanted to control our food system so that they can control our labor. Maize was a lot easier because it's not small grains like millet and sorghum. They could plant this maize, they could get people to plant the maize, then they're the ones who have to grind it. Because remember that our forefathers, because the sorghum and millet are very small, it was easier to just grind it. I'm not opposed to mechanization, but in that particular context, now the British became the new owners of this grinding, the posher mills. So the people now had to rely on the posher mills of the British to grind their maize to make their ugali, you see. And then when the British also introduced, when you have laborers and you want them to be as strong as possible to do whatever work they are doing, and then now they introduced specific meal times so that these people between 2 and 3, now they're going for lunch to consume this ugali from maize. And then now, unfortunately, also from a missionary perspective, when the word went out that almost everything African is uncivilized and borderline demonic, borderline satanic, civilization meant that if you've been consuming sorghum ugali, now you start consuming maize ugali. Now, if you mix that from that approach of the missionaries, yes, preaching the gospel, but embedding into that, to call it bluntly, white supremacist agenda. Because if what you're giving me as a white person is a lot more superior than what I'm consuming, and that's your message, then that's a white supremacist agenda. Away from the politics of it, once we understand that that is how and why maize then spread, it was not just an innocent introduction of a new food. It's not like food exchange, that now they have given us maize, and now we are telling them, okay, take our sorghum and millet. It wasn't that at all. But away from that, the sheer nutritional value, I'm sure someone like yourself or a nutritionist can even break it down for people so that you literally weigh what is the nutritional value between maize and sorghum, between maize and millet, which one has more fiber, which one has more nutrients, from purely that level, between maize and sorghum, which one is more drought resistant? Of course, it's millet. It's not maize, you see. So within that context, then Africa increasingly consumed maize. Don't even get me started on the African leafy vegetables because they are so crazily nutritious and so delicious, but somehow you walk to a lot of urban centers, at least in Kenya, you'll find cabbage a lot more than African leafy vegetables. So you can look at it through the same lens on why and how maize was introduced. These other foods were more gradual. But what was very little, and that's where the decolonizing comes in, is people assuming, either subconsciously or even sometimes consciously, that because this African leafy vegetable is something my grandmother used to consume, and because cabbage is something that was introduced, then cabbage is more superior. Because as long as we still have that psyche, you will continue walking to Kenyan households and you'll continue finding that African leafy vegetables are barely anywhere to be seen. There's just a fringe, on the margins of the society. That's where you find people who have mainstreamed that. So I'm not talking about the occasional once a month or twice a month consumption, but we have to mainstream it because it is along a similar wavelength like the maize.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something us as consumers, we need to look more into. The nutritional values is very, very important, because one of the reasons why we eat food actually is because we need to get nutrients, right? So I think nowadays the equation has been sort of turned upside down. It's more of energy. We are eating because we need energy. No, we're eating because our body requires nutrients. Then after the nutrients, the body has taken the nutrients, then energy available from the food, then we can actually use it for our daily usage. So I think if we approach from that perspective, then it becomes a little bit easier. And it's worrying to see that a lot more young people are not consuming these foods, our local and indigenous foods. As you said, you walk into any urban centers now, we have a lot of international food courts, right? Like KFCs are now in Kenya selling their highly processed foods. One of your videos that I saw, you were basically telling people there's no reason why you should be consuming broiler chicken. Why is that?
First of all, speaking to men, just the African man, if you're a man, listen up. It's very important what you're about to hear. These traditional African foods, whether it's the cassavas, whether it's the groundnuts, just non-processed, locally grown food that is indigenous to Africa, or as a bare minimum has been here for centuries, when you consume that as a man, you are going to enhance your masculinity. You don't need no pills. And we have to talk about these things openly. Those days of hiding are long gone. So the reason men have to realize that you are doing your manhood and your masculinity a great disservice when you consistently consume food that is not adding to your overall health. And again, that's a topic that I'm sure Brian will address one day. That how can organic farming enhance masculinity, and healthy eating as a whole, So I honestly don't say that in jest, because it is indeed true that when you talk about nutrients, the fact that our body need the nutrients, whether it is the zinc, whether it is the magnesium, all those nutrients, the fiber, the less and less of those nutrients that we take, the more harm we're doing to our bodies. It's like slow poison. Now, at a broader level, now this applies to all the genders, men and women. Did you know that every single minute an African dies of cancer? Every single minute. Anybody who doesn't believe, just go and do your own research. Because sometimes sometimes some people say that these are conspiracy theories. But you can go and prove it for yourselves. Yeah, go and prove it that every single minute an African dies from cancer. And a major contributor to that is what we eat. And when I talked about broiler chicken, again, it is because of this crazy proliferation of broiler chicken in Africa. So much so that we have Central African countries like Gabon that then end up importing this broiler chicken en masse from France or from the West because of this absolute corrupt ruling elite that I talked about earlier, because of these colonial mindsets that are in our leaders, because when they do that, it means that just a few corrupt folks at the top are the ones to get those millions of dollars. But if they empower the smallholder farmers, poultry farmers in Gabon to produce indigenous chicken, they don't get no money because it is these smallholders who then get that money. So the reason I spoke really passionately on that issue of broiler chicken is because, again, it is now widely accepted that if you are in the middle class, then you must consume chicken regularly. And the convenience thing, the fast food mentality, man, Africans have to get rid of this fast food mentality. And when I say fast food mentality, of course, I just don't mean the fast food that you consume, but this issue of convenience, you want to make this food as fast as possible, and that's what broiler does. You can buy the broiler, go to your house, put it on the cooker, grab a shower. By the time you're done with the shower and with applying lotion and stuff, it's ready. And you celebrate that because you have no time. Yet maybe it's dinner, it's in the evening, you know. What are you rushing? Exactly what are you rushing towards? So a lot of people are not consuming broiler because it's healthier, but simply because it's just more convenient and it's also cheaper. So we have to ask the question, and this one I will not even give an answer, but people need to dig for themselves. Is there then any linkage between this broiler chicken and some of these diseases, like the data that I've just shared now? When this chicken, which by the way, some grow as fast as 3 weeks and it's ready, ask yourself, is that natural? Is that how God intended chicken to grow? And if your answer is yes, all power to you, continue consuming it. But if you'll have the honesty of realizing that no, this is being speeded up so that the profits can be as high as possible at my expense, then hopefully, if you can dig up yourself, whoever is watching or listening, hopefully you will tell yourself that, wait a minute, I don't have to go this direction.
Yeah, and it's now up to them, right? So we are in the age of information. You can literally Google stuff if you want to get the information, or you can ChatGPT it, and then it can give you all the information you need. And I think now we've lived through like the age of information since the early 2000s. And what I've realized, more information doesn't necessarily reflect like people are going to get better, because now it leaves the action part. Like you have to be at the lead. You have to be at the core of, hey, this is what I've found and this is what I want to do now moving forward. So the impulse, like that ability, hey, this is what I want for my life, has to come from the person themselves after all this information has been shared as well. One of the other areas that I think a lot of people need to talk about is the issue of what you call market apartheid. So this is where you have European companies literally exporting products into Africa that have substandard. So things like powder milk really cannot be sold in Europe, but they can readily actually bring it into the African market. Things like pesticides. There are pesticides that are banned in Europe because they cause cancer, but those pesticides can easily be sold in the African continent, right? We were talking about the issue of decolonization. So from an African perspective, either from a policy or a government or from an individual perspective, what do we need to do in order to counter this kind of market appetite that's going on?
As Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, I cannot ride your back unless you bend down. You know, if you're standing up straight, it's impossible for anybody to ride your back. So Africans keep bending over backwards to allow these things to happen. Now, you mentioned a very, very good example. Let's say something like milk powder. Do you know the farmer who sells their milk to the large milk factories? They sell 1 liter of milk at extremely low prices. So when we say that, for example, in Kenya, that milk is expensive, it is because of capitalism. It is because the factories that are processing this milk, that are pasteurizing this milk, it is because they want to make as much money as possible. Now, picture a scenario where the government puts in place a policy that zero rates import of pasteurizing machines. Even better, puts in place a long-term approach, mid and long-term approach on Kenya producing these pasteurizing machines locally, so that we demystify pasteurizing, meaning that every 50 or so farmers are on their own a milk factory. Yeah. You know, it means that the price of milk can even come down to half of what it is, and it will become a lot more expensive to purchase powder milk or long life milk because the fresh milk is easily available. But do you know, Brian, that the situation is worse in Nigeria? Because at least in Nairobi, you can go to the shop and you'll buy a fresh packet of milk. In Nigeria, it is so difficult. In many parts of a city like Lagos, you can't even purchase the fresh milk. You can't. Yet, the Fulani people and a lot of Nigerians, not just the Fulani, have a lot of livestock. It's not that there's no milk in Nigeria. It's not that there's no milk in Ghana. The problem is that this chronic capitalistic system that we have fueling our economies, they treat these livestock farmers as rubbish. They treat them as mere producers of milk, yet that milk is the main thing that the milk sector is all about. Whether you're talking about cheese or, name it, it all cannot be there if there's no milk, you see. So the reason we have allowed the market apartheid to thrive is because in our minds, we continue to associate things like powdered milk as a convenient alternative for the middle class, for the upper class, so that all I have to do is to march into the supermarket, buy 5 kilos of powder milk, and then I can whip it up anytime I want. I don't have to keep going to the shop. And that's the mindset that we as Africans have to get rid of. If there's one thing we have to do as Africans, it is to completely decolonize our minds systematically, so that we're asking ourselves, regarding the dairy sector, what does decolonization look like? And then we would have the answer that every single Kenyan, every single Ugandan, every single Zimbabwean who owns a cow is a treasure to the country and must be treated as a treasure to the country and must be helped to earn optimal returns from their milk. Because if we have a scenario where fresh milk is increasingly available and increasingly affordable, it means that more and more Kenyans, more and more Zimbabweans, more and more Ugandans are going to have money in their pocket. Because what the middle class has been spending on powdered milk, they'll now start spending it on this fresh milk.
Let's talk about someone who is trying to decolonize the African continent. Ibrahim Traoré has been at the core, really, of someone who is doing something from the African continent. What do we need to know about Ibrahim Traoré from his early childhood or from his early life that has made him to be who he is today?
Well, March 14th, 1988, the day that Ibrahim Traoré was born, I would hope that more and more Africans on that particular day would just pause to reflect a bit. Now, let me, at this juncture, address the people who usually say, hey, DJ, are you obsessed by Ibrahim Traoré? My answer is simple. I am obsessed with transformative leadership. I'm totally obsessed by transformative leadership, which is why I am then obsessed by extension with Thomas Sankara, now Ibrahim Traoré, Patrice Lumumba. And the common denominator that those three have is that they all became leaders in their mid-20s, 34, 33 years old there. Why I mention that is Africa is the most youthful continent. So the young people of Africa must then realize that there is no excuse. There is no excuse. Like in Kenya, Kenyans can no longer blame Odinga. They can no longer blame Musyoka. You have to look in the mirror, especially if you're young, and then blame yourself. Because if 2027 reaches, and then Kenyans again vote for more of the same, yet the youth of Kenya are the most populous. The biggest electoral bloc in the country, in Kenya, is the youth. And it's the same story across Africa. So I'm giving that context because let us not forget the fact that he was 34 years old on September 30th, 2022, when he took over the reins of leadership. And people need to realize that for him to even somehow engineer that entire movement within the army to then be able to defeat his military superiors. Because remember, the guy who was president at the time, a guy called Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba, that guy was also a military, but way higher in rank, military rank than Traoré. He had taken over on January 24th of the same year. So you have a case where your senior in the military is the president. You have a case where not only are you 34 years old, but you're a captain, you're way below in military rankings. Not just that, Brian, but you're also located in a town called Kaya, 100 kilometers away from Ouagadougou, where the action is, where the seat of power is. So for him to somehow, despite all those things, engineer that movement, lead that movement within the army, that then on that day of September 30th, his good friend, a guy called Captain Farouk Sorgo, was able to announce, if you look at that video, the guy who is announcing, it's not even Traoré, it is this guy, Captain Farouk. Yeah. Now, for him to work closely with all these people and to actually take over power says a lot about the leader that he is. Now, for those of you who may be quick to say that, that was just a coup d'etat, try organizing. Try organizing one yourself. Yeah, that's when you'll realize that if you don't lose your life instantly, because by the way, the Constitution of Kenya is very clear on how a president should be replaced. Yeah. So for the record, I am not saying on the Organic Guys podcast that Kenyans should organize a coup. No, we're only saying that it was not easy for Traoré to do what he did. And we are then saying that one of the inspirations that Kenyans should draw from that is what I call a ballot revolution. Kenyans have to ensure that come 2027, they also have a ballot revolution that the Constitution allows. Because after 5 years, this duration that the president is in office, Kenyans should realize that the same way that Traoré, young as he was able to organize this massive movement that delivered presidency to his bosom that day, that you too, however young you are, however old you are, as long as you're going to decolonize your mind, you too can organize yourselves in such a manner that come election day, the kind of leaders, all the way from the president to the members of county assemblies, in the 1,450 wards in Kenya, there's no reason why they should not be transformative leaders. And that is what I'm obsessed with. So, if you're a Kenyan and you're watching this, you should ask yourself, do you want to do what Traoré did and put yourself up to be elected as president of Kenya? That is a constitutional means of doing it. And if not, who are you going to support? Because if you'll just perpetuate this perennial support for the same old guard, that they're basically cut from the same cloth, then, you're part of the problem. There are people who are now saying that if he's that popular, why doesn't he call for elections? And the answer to you is that nearly half of Burkina Faso is under the control of jihadists. Imagine if Kenya, nearly half of Kenya, was not even under government control. How on earth can you organize elections when nearly half of the country cannot even vote in those elections? Now, if you go ahead and pose the question, but he took over claiming that he was going to get rid of this insecurity and the jihadists, 2 years down the road he hasn't done that, you need to realize that there was a time, Brian, when the United States of America was supporting Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They were supporting him because the Mujahideen was fighting against the Soviets at the time. And why I remind people that is, those jihadists that you're seeing, they are not just fighting for themselves. They also have support behind the scenes. And history has already shown that there have been times when the West has supported the jihadists of that time because of ulterior political reasons, ulterior economic reasons. So if Traoré is essentially, if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are essentially fighting puppets, yes, these jihadists have their own grievances, but if also part of that is that they are becoming puppets to another agenda, then how on earth is he supposed to beat that? You see? So Africa must smell the coffee and answer the question, how can we stand with Burkina Faso? Even if you don't like Traoré, how can we stand with the people of Burkina Faso, the people of Niger, the people of Mali, so that they can once and for all root out this jihadist tumor that is really leaving them in a very disadvantaged state.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point because it's usually complex than what we see on the ground, like what is presented in the news. So I think from that perspective, most people don't know that there is actually a war happening, like half of the country that is against Traoré. From an achievement point of view and from an agricultural point of view, what has impressed you most? What has Traoré done that has impressed you most that is helping his people?
Having talked to the Burkinabe themselves, having even met some of them, we need to understand that, number one, imagine a scenario, Brian, in your house. Let's say that, you're about to have dinner and violent robbers come and they're knocking down at your door. Imagine then me calling you and accusing you that, why aren't you finishing making dinner, Because at that time, survival demands that you handle these people who are trying to storm into your house. Now, that's what's happening in Burkina Faso, where on the one hand, he has to balance defending his country with exactly what you're saying, ensuring that agriculture, there's a lot of rice in Burkina Faso, a lot of cotton. The western part of Burkina Faso, where he was born, a region called Bondokouy, is a very agricultural part of the country. So for him, agriculture is not just, it's something that is also within him, because like millions of Africans, he grew up in an agricultural village. One definite thing that he has really tried to do, actually two, would be mechanizing farming so that people can get the most from their labor. It is from that philosophical standpoint that if I will spend only 1 hour to do what would have taken me 50 hours to do, then that is productivity. And notice though that he's mechanizing farming for the smallholders. He's really done a lot from acquiring subsidized tractors, from helping these farmers to use these tractors so that their productivity can be optimized. That's number one. The second thing that the Burkinabe government is currently doing is focusing a lot on value addition, because he too believes a lot in decolonizing Africa and realizes that unless we add value to our produce so that we sell it in a manner that gives us the most returns, we remain beholden to the folks out there, to the foreigners. So from things like value addition to tomatoes, there are people who say that, but that's a simple thing. Then ask yourself why you go to the supermarket here in Nairobi. A lot of the ketchup you find is imported. Yeah, exactly. So we have to go back to the basics, which is what he's doing. And it's not just tomatoes alone. There are things like cashew nuts, that the Burkinabe government is systematically working on value addition for different agricultural produce, despite the fact that there's a murderer, a robber, banging down the door of Burkina Faso, and he has to deal with that while at the same time dealing with this.
It's something that we also have to appreciate because it's something that is also happening like in most African countries, that there's somehow a war that is happening within that country. And that begs like the bigger question, you yourself as a Pan-Africanist, can we ever envision or come to that conclusion that we can have the United States of Africa that Gaddafi ever envisions, considering we have so many countries within the African continent, we have so many conflicts going on? Is that a reality that Africans should actually push for?
Absolutely. Brian, just maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, if you had said that in less than 3 years, there's going to be artificial intelligence that is going to be almost ubiquitous, that you can be able to have a conversation with a chat box on any number of issues, and you can even generate a whole video, realistic video or realistic images, that you can even do coding, all manner of things. People would have looked at you and said that you're crazy, man, you're crazy. Yet here we are, and this is happening. But behind the scenes, of course, there are a lot of folks who've been working for decades, for a long time, to actualize this. In the same way that behind the scenes, there are a lot of folks, people like us, who are also working towards this Pan-African unity. So yes, a united Africa is absolutely possible. A united Africa will definitely happen. How we get there is what we need to work on a bit more. For instance, we have to give credit where it's due, and the fact that Kenya has completely abolished visas now for all Africans is something laudable. It's totally laudable. Previously, I know that you still needed electronic something, but now you don't. So a Nigerian can wake up tomorrow and just come to Kenya. They literally, coming to Nairobi from Lagos is almost like going to Ibadan from Lagos. See, coming to Nairobi from Cape Town is almost like just going to Joburg from Cape Town, regarding the need of having necessary permits. So that alone is something worth celebrating, and we are calling on all African countries to completely abolish visas, because here's what will happen, and here is how we will make this United States of Africa a reality sooner rather than later, by making the borders increasingly irrelevant. Because if you can go to Nigeria without requiring any permit, imagine if you can do that for the whole of Africa. Then we have to take it to the next level and also abolish work permits for every single African. So that if you want to go and for a year do podcasting in Zambia, you just do that. Nobody's going to ask you, where is the permit? As long as you're paying the taxes that even Zambians are paying, you see. Then the other thing that has to happen is this, and I'll share an anecdote there. About 5 years ago, I got really, really tired of just saying that we need Africa Continental Free Trade Area to be fully actualized. I realized that a time reaches where you have to live what you preach. So I asked myself, what can I as DJ Bwakali sell to the rest of Africa so that I can actually experience how that is? And then about 2 years earlier, I had started this platform for African products, where I felt like I wanted to take Masai Market to the world, because I felt that it takes a lot of skill and effort for the people who produce these Kenyan products to do so, and they shouldn't have to rely on a few tourists who happen to pass by. So I did start that platform, and then I was like, but there are a lot of Africans who may not necessarily come online to see this. Yeah, so what I did, I deliberately sought out small-scale traders in Botswana, in South Africa, who could then buy my products that I didn't produce myself, but other people are producing. So I was expanding the market reach for them. And the most common product was the Maasai sandals also known as Swahili sandals, that are so unique to Kenya, that I wish Kenya realized how there are a number of Kenyan products that should make small-scale traders a lot of money. Now, hurdle number one was this: transporting these products by air to the southern part of Africa was prohibitively expensive, so much so that the sandals would become almost unaffordable to people there if I went down that route. Then I discovered I could use some trucks. There are trucks that go from Nairobi all the way to South Africa, and wherever they pass, they can leave luggage. So those ones were a lot more affordable. And for almost a year, I experienced that. But then I also faced hurdles of tax, where sometimes these products would reach a given border and tax has to be paid. So the end consumer in South Africa, the end consumer in Botswana, is paying a lot more for these sandals, meaning that fewer people are buying them. So imagine now a scenario where all that is abolished. There are no taxes. The goods can move freely across the continent. If you want an agbada from Nigeria, you can easily get it and pay almost as much as what a Nigerian paid. The only addition is just the transportation. But if they transported 1,000 agbadas to Kenya, for those who don't know agbada, it would be those Nigerian wear. Yeah. So the point I'm making is that let us make it easy for Africans to move across Africa. Let us make it easy for goods to move across Africa. Because if we do so, and if we make it easy for African labor to move across Africa, if we address the issue of labor, the issue of goods, and the issue of people themselves, then it will almost not matter that you have a Kenyan passport, because you can easily show up in any African country and still have a life there. Now, the more that happens, Brian, the more Africans will begin to acknowledge and realize that why are we then spending all this money on all these presidents? You see, yeah, but it will be more spontaneous, because if we start with that political standpoint, then it's going to be a stillbirth. But if we start with these more manageable aspects, and people begin seeing that it is way more profitable to actually unite as Africa. It is not just a fringe Pan-Africanist thing by the likes of Bwakali or Brian, but it is much better for my own existence, my own productivity, if Africa is more united. And then at that level, we will begin having conversations of, okay, wait a minute, what about an all-Africa army? What if we had a super crazily powerful all-Africa army, that has the discipline of a professional army? All of a sudden, you're like, oops, the rapid support forces cannot just bully around people in Sudan. They cannot just commit genocide, because there's a huge deterrent, namely all-African army, you see. Then there's the issue that I've also talked about, and this will just blow your mind completely, because it shows you the dysfunction that we have. Way, way, way back, 1992, I believe it was, the mid-90s there, the Abuja Treaty came into force, saying that Africa should have an all-Africa currency. Now, if you've traveled across Africa, you've seen the utter stupidity, I can't think of a less polite term, of your Kenya shillings being completely valueless in most of the other African countries. You see, why do you have to change your Kenya shillings to a US dollar and then to a South African rand or to whichever other currency? You see, so as we address these issues that will unite us more, the matter of currency will then become an electoral issue. In fact, I am now challenging Tanzania again, because they're the ones who have elections this year. So we will keep hammering this, that how about Mama Suluhu and the leaders in Tanzania, how about you put that as a referendum question? That do the people of Tanzania want an all-Africa currency or not? It's a simple yes or no, you see. Because if they say yes, and 2027 Kenya says yes, it becomes an electoral issue that puts political pressure on all the leaders to simply actualize it, because it already came into force, It already came into force. So yes, a united Africa is possible. A United States of Africa is possible. And what we have to do to already actualize the benefits, optimize the returns of a united Africa, more united Africa, is taking these steps that I've talked about.
Is the African Union helping? Because it's been around for such a long time. I don't know, like since the 1940s. I don't know if you've seen a clip where there's a small guy who is asking, what are these people at the African Union doing? Meeting after meeting, right? So what is the African Union doing wrong?
The African Union, just like the United Nations, needs a complete overhaul. In its current formation, the African Union cannot be truly responsive to the present day needs of Africa. It needs a complete overhaul. The African Union must become more of an organized movement and not a bureaucratic body. The Organization of African Unity, which was there in the early 1960s when African countries started gaining independence, was actually arguably a bit more effective in terms of the drive, because you had the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, you had the likes of Emperor Haile Selassie, who had that drive, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, people who truly had seen that based on the fact that colonialism had messed up our countries, we are better off a bit more united, you see. And then the Organization of African Unity then metamorphosed into the African Union in the early 2000s. But what we are saying is that clearly the African Union is no longer responsive to the contemporary needs of Africa. It's just no longer responsive. Whether it is the war, whether it is a famine, you would be hard-pressed to find something that the African Union has successfully worked on, you see. Because even the all-Africa currency was passed by the Organization of African Unity. It was not even the African Union at the time, you see. So we are saying that, can we make the African Union an electoral issue? Because I am completely sick and tired of Pan-Africanists like myself always articulating what is wrong, but never what then should we do. Because when we do that, we disempower ourselves. And the reason I keep bringing the conversation back to, can we make this an electoral issue? Because it is a very concrete, systematic way of the African people speaking to these matters directly. Because you know very well that politicians respond to electoral issues. That's like the meat and bread of politicians. So if Africans across the board are saying that the African Union is just not effective, if that is captured in a referendum, then it will have to be reformed. Because if it is not reformed drastically, I'm not just talking about panel beating, but drastically, what will happen is that we are going to then invest a lot of our energies in the Alliance of Sahel states. We are then the one that is between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. We are then going to tell them, can you remove the word Sahelian states? Can you just say Alliance of African States? And can we begin having Africans themselves buying into that? But we're still giving the African Union time, but their time is running out.
It's running out quickly because we need results, right? Yeah. So I'm not sure what's your take on this, because even before we get into like the modern state of democracy, before the settlers came into Africa didn't really have democracy, right? We lived within us tribal. We were led by tribal chiefs. Like each tribe had their chiefs, and then they could guide each tribe that they are on. And if you look in the other parts of the world, especially in the Arab world, they don't necessarily have democracy, right? They have kings who in turn govern their people. We have had the experiment of democracy so far in Africa. Do you think it's working?
No, it's not. It's not. It's not. And which is not to say that let's stop having elections, but if you're addicted, the starting point is to not to be in denial, to just accept, or if you have a problem, any problem, because as long as you deny that you have that problem, you can't solve it. So we have to look long and hard in the democracy mirror and realize that no, it's just not working. Because when you have Paul Biya running for elections in Cameroon at the age of 91, and he is going to be welcomed by Trump in the White House because he's democratically elected, but Ibrahim Traoré will not be welcome because he's not democratically elected. You see, that just tells you the utter hypocrisy and dysfunction of this Western-style democracy. Remember, Africa, in a nutshell, anybody who feels like, but what did you have? What better proposal do you have? Africa had a peer-based governance. Whether it was an absolute monarch, there was still elders. There was still, the different age groups still had some form of governance amongst them. And the fact that it was peer-based, actually, that's what the African Union looked at way back in the 2000s when they tried to come up with the Africa peer review mechanism where presidents could review each other so that Mama Suluhu can tell Mzee Ruto that, no, that's not cool. Of course, it didn't work because a lot of them are the corrupt ruling elite, so they didn't ensure that it works. But that whole principle of peer-based governance that is not a popularity contest is something that we have to look back at. Personally, I call it Afrocracy, to give a tag to an African form of governance that is still maintaining the good that is in democracy, but not just copying and pasting Western-style democracy, because the Westphalian governance that has been popularized by Europe, where you have a given state structure that then speaks to governance within this structure, the fact that it was copied and pasted into Africa via Berlin is just not working. It's just not working. So even as we maintain these borders that we currently have, we need to pose that question that very, very honestly, why is it that the United Arab Emirates, even people from New York, are now migrating to go to Dubai? Why is it that Saudi Arabia, building that billion-dollar city in the desert, Donald Trump himself had to take a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf states, because that's where the money is. Yet those are absolute monarchs, you see. So you just can't have a scenario where they look at Africa and say that you people must have democracy that looks like this or like that. The African people must really address this issue of how can we combine, how can we have a hybrid solution that works for us so that that sovereign power that is vested in the people doesn't boil down to whoever has the biggest voice or the biggest wallet, then calling the shots in the name of democracy.
Yeah, because there's no explanation why Biya should up for election, surely. Yeah, so because I always try to understand, like, what is the motivation? You've been in power for so long and then not getting satisfied. And it looks like Africa, to a greater part, has this problem of where a lot older people are so inclined to like staying in power rather than living into the future generation. Is it an African problem or is it just power problem?
I would really need to put things into perspective, because to the extent that the world looks at it as an African problem and points to the likes of Biya and Museveni and president of Equatorial Guinea and the former president of Gabon, Omar Bongo, a number of these dudes who had been around forever, people use that as empirical evidence to show that maybe this is an African problem. But remember, most of those people were enabled through this Western-style democracy, through the geopolitics of the Cold War, that needed these puppets to be in power, That is why the CIA itself, it is on record that it played a role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And the CIA and America, by extension, then went ahead to completely support Mobutu Sese Seko, you see. So when Mobutu Sese Seko stayed in power for that long, it was actually largely because he was enabled by the West because of the Cold War scenario. When people like Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, democratically elected, was frustrated by the same global geopolitics of the time because the African socialism that he preached was perceived as being a chapter in the communism book, you see. So imagine if Mwalimu Julius Nyerere had not been interfered with, had not been suppressed globally like he was, and if that experiment of African socialism had then completely risen head and shoulder above all other forms of governance, of course other African countries would have followed similar footsteps. But now Tanzania itself points at Kenya. You know, the naysayers would say that, you see, Kenya's economy is much better than Tanzania, yet those underlying dynamics were a big problem. So the issue is not the longevity of reign per se, because even Xi Jinping is now becoming, you know, quite a long-serving. They have changed the law in China to just allow him to go on forever. A number of these monarchs, you know, in an absolute monarchy, it's until you die. But so we shouldn't just look at the longevity per se, but we should look at the underlying structural issues in this governance and where we should take responsibility. For example, the isms of nepotism, tribalism, let's take responsibility. Because if you're going to vote for somebody just because they're from your tribe, then yes, that's your problem. And yes, we have to deal with that. We have to look at that log in our eye. But as we do so, can we also realize and acknowledge that if you happen to have an extremely high fever because you have a malaria virus in you, it's not helpful for me to just look at that fever alone. I have to go and take out that virus. And one of the viruses that is in the African governance today is that whole-scale copying and pasting of Western-style democracy. Yet, even America itself, Brian, doesn't vote the way we do. They're the kings and queens of Western-style democracy, but they have an electoral college so that they can give power to the small states just like the big states. So if they had to come up with their own system that works, they shouldn't preach to Africa to just copy everything, you see. So the onus is on us Africans to begin changing this Western-style democracy with a hybrid solution that truly works for us.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be looked at. And as you mentioned, the nuances are usually not talked about enough, in my opinion, as well, because it's also something that a lot of people look at for the modern day Zimbabwe, where they say, look at when Mugabe came in, I was given a really thriving Zimbabwe, and then it collapsed. But they don't look at the sanctions that Zimbabwe was put on in order for it to not to thrive, right? So there's more nuances than it meets the eye, and I think a lot more people will be really served if they actually take that into consideration as well before they put everything into a blanket. So as we finish, I have to ask you about Thomas Sankara. I know you're a huge admirer of his. What about him do you like most? And what about him do you wish the young people of the African continent can really adopt?
Oh, yes. I absolutely celebrate Thomas Sankara, primarily because he was a pragmatic revolutionary. He was not just an idealistic revolutionary. And there's a big difference there. One of the dangers of being an idealistic revolutionary is you then live in a utopian world and you do not translate the vision in your mind to the reality on the ground. But Thomas Sankara was a pragmatic revolutionary, and I'll give you two examples. Thomas Sankara, he changed the feudal system of land. We talked about land earlier. Burkina Faso had this situation as is still the case in countries like Kenya, where there were like these feudal lords who owned massive tracts of land, either because they were really connected to the French colonizers, or they just, in a very corrupt way, took advantage of the existing political dynamics. So Thomas Sankara faced that head on and made land much more available to the smallholders in Burkina Faso. And when he did that, even before his assassination, the agricultural productivity had really increased in the country. Thomas Sankara also went out of his way to find qualified Burkinabe to work as ministers. He was totally opposed to nepotism, and anachronism also. He totally went out of his way to find the best and brightest Burkinabe to then work alongside him to realize his policies. I'm an environmentalist myself, not in the African sense, but also in the technical sense. And Thomas Sankara, way before Wangari Maathai put environmentalism and governance on the map as two sides of the same coin, Thomas Sankara had done it when he spearheaded a whole movement of tree planting, tree growing in Burkina Faso. Not just planting a tree for the sake of photo ops, but literally ensuring that this tree grows to maturity. He did that way before, Brian, way before this issue of gender equality and gender equity was rightfully being addressed globally. Thomas Sankara was doing it in Burkina Faso. He talked about that famous quote of his that I can hear the loud roar of women's silence, to speak to the fact that he understood that there was a measure of suppression when it came to women. There was a measure of stifling and strangling, their progress. And he addressed that head on. He didn't hide behind tradition or anything. One of his biggest contributions that people are forgetting, and we have to bring it back, is the debt issue, man. Thomas Sankara made it so clear that debt is simply a new way of neocolonialism, which is still the case. Because virtually every sub-Saharan African country today is spending a disproportionately higher amount of money to service debts than on healthcare, than on education. That can't work. It just can't work. And Thomas Sankara had brought that issue to the fore. He had brought it to the fore, and he did a great job in articulating why the debt issue was messing up Africa. And he was advocating for the same thing I'm advocating for today. Let's just not pay those debts. It's as simple as that. If the Moody's rating systems and all these Wall Street rating systems then rate us very poorly, let them rate the entire Africa as poorly. You see? Because we just can't have a scenario where these odious debts, which are debts that were borrowed without your permission, without my permission, yet it's the taxpayers' money that we're talking about here. So those are just a few pillars of Thomas Sankara's not just rhetoric, but policies and governance that are so critical, and we have to look back to that.
Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, I've had the privilege to look some of his work. I urge everybody who has the time to go and read his biography and his beliefs and what he stood for. I think it will be motivational to a lot of us, especially for us as young people in the African continent as well. You have been part of the Busia Senator Okiya Mtata's presidential exploratory committee. You've been traversing different parts of the country. What have you learned about the Kenyan electorate? And what are they yearning for? What are they looking for?
First of all, I have always believed and will always believe that you cannot do things the same way that you've done them and expect different results. So Kenyans are guilty of constantly voting for folks cut from the same cloth and expecting different results, just as much as even most of Africa. For example, in Nigeria, in the last elections, I wasn't rooting for the current president. I was rooting for another candidate. I was later told that just because he's from a certain community, it was very difficult for, I'm talking about Peter Obi. Now, I am not privy to the machinations and nuances of Nigerian politics, but I have to say that as a non-Nigerian, it seemed to me that he had the modesty that is completely absent from the corrupt ruling elite, and that is not fake. And it seems to me that he would have then brought the same, even at the governance level. I understand that locally within Nigeria, maybe his community was a disadvantage, amongst many other things, you see. But the reason I mention that is just like Kenya, you find a country like Nigeria, a lot of times, the people themselves, the considerations that they bring on the table when they are casting their ballots are part of the problem. And it's for that reason that when Senator Kiomtata reached out and, wanted me to be part of this committee, I wholeheartedly agreed. Number one, because when there was those Gen Z demonstrations in Kenya last year, I did look and ask myself, who is the man of the moment who can take this country forward? The same way I pose that question of every other African country. And at that time, he was amongst the people I thought can actually take the country forward. And as fate would have it, a lot of Gen Zs seem to also agree with that. Now, it is still 2+ years to the next elections, but when I look at the track record, I could see a track record of somebody who had constantly fought for the people, somebody who believed in constitutionalism, you see. And I had reached all those conclusions even before he reached out to me. And to show you that, he's a different kind of a leader, Senator Kiomtata is not somebody that I knew personally before last year, at all. But he doesn't believe in chronism or nepotism or tribalism. So he simply reached out to somebody he thought, based on the evidence on his table, that this person could actually play a role in that committee, which in itself speaks to the kind of leader that he is. So I unequivocally say that even though the work of that committee is still ongoing and it will be concluded before the end of this year, but I can unequivocally say that if elections were to be held in Kenya tomorrow, I would personally cast my ballot for him. Previously, I remember in 2013, I cast my vote for Professor James Ole Kiapi for the same reasons. Because I didn't believe that you had to vote either for Odinga or for, because that's part of the problem. And I really, really, really urge all Kenyans that irrespective of who you're thinking to vote for today, just ask yourself the question, if this person that you want to vote for is cut from the same cloth, is this person that you want to vote for simply part of the same corrupt ruling elite? Because if the answer is yes, then I have to tell you without blinking that you're part of the problem. You're totally part of the problem. And the same applies to every African. In Nigeria, when you go to the ballots, if you cannot see an alternative that you feel that this is then the person I'll vote for, then put yourself up there.
Yeah, and I think that's the level of accountability we need from young people. I don't know. It always seems to say you can't, at least from our Kenyan constitution, I think you can't run until you're 35 or something. But that should not be a hindrance for young people to actually want to be part of other electoral positions, whether it's an MCA or an MP or just a representative of the people. You want to have that opportunity so that you can grow your political influence as well. So looking forward to that report and see what comes out of it. Finally, as we finish, you wear so many hats: writer, journalist, environmentalist, Pan-Africanist. When all is said and done, what do you want people to remember you for?
You see, the Pan-Africanist is not what I do, it's just who I am. And I would want that example to shine bright to all Africans, that you can also move from looking at Africa as something that you do and just look at Africa as who you are. Look at the fact that you're African, and back to what I always say, then tap into your African superpower. I really want, if there's one takeaway that people should take from both my words and life, it's actually that within you there's an African superpower that you can tap into. Now, you can break that down into a lot more smaller pieces and more concrete action points. But what matters is you just having the realization that you're enough. As an African, you truly are enough, because the truth of the matter is that in this current generation, we have a huge percentage of Africans, they may not voice it, but a huge percentage of Africans feel like they would rather be on another continent, whether it is the Gulf states or whether it is Europe or America. And I don't begrudge them for that, because even those who are not there, it is because of lack of opportunity. There's a reason the green card applications are in millions every single year. So the problem is not in going there, because I firmly believe that when God created this earth, he gave every human being a right to live wherever they want on this earth, to travel wherever they want on this earth. So the problem is not in living in wherever you want to live on this earth, but the problem is in having a mindset that looks as Africa as not enough, as inferior, because we have to change that mindset and look at Africa as enough and realize that there's something called the African dream, that we should invest our time and energies in realizing the African dream that brings out our African superpower. You know, things like decent jobs. There's something called opportunity gap, where you find in Africa millions of graduates, man, who you even have a medical degree, you know. You've been in school for 5 to 7 years. Now, the doctor-patient ratio in Africa is dismal, completely dismal. So we need you, but you have unemployed doctors, you know. So there's that kind of opportunity gap that has to be addressed, which is why I also now really invest my energies on this governance issue, because NGOs will only take you so far. And Africa has been in this unfortunate place where we began to rely a lot on NGOs to do what the government should be doing. That's unacceptable. So can we work on this African superpower? And one of the best things that you can do to address that is by ensuring that governance at your national level moves away from those corrupt ruling elite.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. That's that's something that each and every single one of us should aspire to be, or to empower other young people to look up to. So I really appreciate that. This is a segment where I call the rapid fire questions. So what I've done is I've prepared 10 questions for you. The idea is just to give quick answers to the questions. And hopefully from it, guys will be able to learn a little bit more about you, just in case it didn't come through the pod. Now I'm ready.
Yep.
So the first question is, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a storyteller, so I'm doing exactly what I wanted to be.
That's nice. If Africa could speak, what injustice would it cry out the loudest?
The poverty, because it diminishes the worth and dignity of people when you do not know where your next meal will come from.
Third question, which African historical figure would you have to have dinner with? I think we know this, but I can let you answer it.
Hands down, Thomas Sankara.
Fourth question, what daily habit grounds you in your purpose and keeps you going?
Meditation and prayer. Meditation is listening to God. Prayer is you speaking to God.
Nice. Fifth question, what's one myth about Africa do we urgently need to bury?
That Africa is inferior.
Sixth, if you could eat only one indigenous African dish for the rest of your life, what will it be?
It would be the leafy vegetables.
Seventh question, which book radically shifted how you see Africa?
Clearly, Dr. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I urge everybody to read it.
Eighth question, what African country do you dream of exploring?
Ethiopia.
Ninth, what quote do you carry with like a compass when the tough gets going?
Africa is my superpower.
Last question, if you could whisper one truth to your 18-year-old self, what would you say?
You're enough. Just being African, you're enough.
Well, that's enough for this podcast. It has been really a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for being open to sharing your ideas and the experience that you had in life through all this time. So really appreciate it. Hopefully, this conversation will at least empower someone to look at Africa on a different perspective and to look at farming in a different perspective, really, on, how we can improve it and how we can make our food system work for us rather than against us. So I really appreciate for making time for the podcast.
You're most welcome, and thank you so much for what you're doing. Let me seize this chance to conclude by asking people, go buy my book, Savannah Footprints, Wisdom Whispers from Historic African Leaders. It's right there in the description. Go buy it. And then finally, what you're doing is amazing, because as I told the offset, the day Africa addresses its food sovereignty, everything else falls into place.
Yeah, and you recently started a YouTube, so you can just share, if someone wants to get in touch with you, just your social media handles and just your email.
Yes, I have this YouTube channel called African Awakening. As the name suggests, it's really about this generation of Africans awakening, uniting, and then transforming the continent. It's at DJ Bwakali, just my name, that's DJ Bwakali. The same handle for Instagram and TikTok, where I also do a lot of short form videos. Yes.
Yeah, very empowering, especially on social media, TikTok, Instagram. Really great follow for the latest take on what's happening in the African continent. So highly suggest that. All right. So till the next podcast, remember to be organic. Cheers.